Hello everybody, and welcome to the video where I lose all my credibility by revealing that I hate one of your favorite games. I assume that this happens to all gaming hobbyists. You spend long enough playing a variety of video games, and eventually you come around to playing a timeless classic, only to discover that it makes you terribly bored and or frustrated, and you just don't get the hype. That's happened to me quite a few times, and today I reveal which games over the years are the ones that just had me shaking my head in anticipation. I'm not going to include Dark Souls 3 today, solely for the fact that I've already covered that on the channel more than once. Number 1. Devil May Cry 3 is a fantastic game. Truly, in my opinion, one of the most excellent games on the PlayStation 2, with smooth combat-based gameplay, tons of variety and attack options, and in each level, a fantastic boss. The game has brilliantly challenging gameplay, full of versatility, and it rewards you with hilarious, cutting-edge animated cutscenes throughout. However, I regret to say that 3, in my opinion, is the only great game in its series, and also the only one worth playing. When I played Devil May Cry 5, I was immediately disappointed. Whereas I expected an extreme challenge to keep me on my toes like 3 did, I got a supremely imbalanced game with ridiculously easy combat, whereby I could spam the same attack over and over and win with no effort. Throughout each of the 20 levels, I got incredibly bored as I button mashed my way through a story with cutscenes that never even succeeded in making me laugh. This game could have been improved with one very simple thing. If only the higher difficulty options weren't locked until you beat the game, then maybe there would have been enough protein in it to satisfy me, but unlike the much superior DMC3, 5 has egregiously easy gameplay, only a small handful of reused and recycled enemy types, some terrible bosses, poor writing and voice acting, and far less appealing cutscenes than we get in 3. It has boring levels with dark red and gray aesthetics. The new character of V is, well, all I really need to do is show you this Adam Driver looking MF to give you my impression of him. And really, the only appeal to DMC5 is that it concludes the arcs of these characters. Maybe if I were more invested in the stories of Dante, Virgil, and Nero, then I would have enjoyed Devil May Cry 5? But in my honest experience, it was just so easy that I stopped trying or paying attention at about 2/3 through. I beat the game, but I never got a game over, and I have no plans to play the special edition. Numbers 2 and 3. BioShock and BioShock Infinite, a couple of apparently well-beloved FPS games known for their dark and satirical atmospheres, their deep lore, their surreal plot twists, and their fast-paced action. I played both of these games on the Xbox 360 when I was quite a bit younger, even before I started doing YouTube, and although I worked hard to beat both of these games, the reason I couldn't get into them wasn't because they were too hard for me. It wasn't that I got stuck and rage quit. It was that, although both games had genuinely great environment design, I was never wowed by the story, and the gameplay was a bit too easy and repetitive. BioShock 1 was an interesting romp through a ruined city at the bottom of the seafloor. Its story didn't make a lot of sense to me, didn't have me very invested. The plot twists felt slightly forced, and the final boss was just a strange monster man that really came out of nowhere and didn't seem to match the tone of the rest of the story. The run-and-gun gameplay didn't provide much of a serious challenge. I didn't feel like it had a lot of variety in what I was supposed to do, and I was almost distraught at the end of the game when I found out I had gotten an abrupt bad ending for killing one single NPC at the beginning of the game, which I was specifically instructed to kill. The next day I played through the entire game once again just to spare all the little girls and get the good ending, but at that point I was so over this game. I mean, I loved the setting, but the gameplay just felt like any other FPS, and maybe I'd need to play it all over again to see what's so great about the story. Meanwhile, BioShock Infinite was much longer, but not much better. I thought it had more fun FPS gameplay, but it didn't make up for the things I hated. Once again, the story was like a confusing mishmash of intentionally surreal and cryptic time travel-related ideas that failed to keep me hooked in the otherwise beautiful sky-high world of Columbia. I thought that Infinite, true to its name, dragged on too long, and granted that I had more fun with the combat, the gameplay cycle was simplified down to following a literal arrow on the ground that would point you exactly in the direction of where you need to go. Infinite became so linear that to beat this excessively long game, I had to do nothing but ignore everything around me and follow a magical arrow of guidance whose path was occasionally interrupted by the odd cutscene or combat sequence. But by far the most egregious flaw with BioShock Infinite, or at least the Xbox 360 version that I played, was its lack of a manual save feature. Infinite only has automatic save checkpoints, and their only problem is they simply do not work. I looked up this problem many times to make sure it's not just me, and yes, there are many other players complaining about Infinite's save mechanic. There were no checkpoints for the final stretch of the game, and I was forced to impatiently survive the whole final 6 hours or so of the story, following an arrow around and generally just ignoring everything else in order to finally get it over with. At a certain point near one of the game's final bosses, my curiosity got the better of me as I soft-locked myself behind a piece of furniture. I was then forced to restart the game, losing hours of progress. I hear fantastic things about BioShock and BioShock Infinite, but unfortunately I only remember the original BioShock as a slightly above-average game with an interesting world but repetitive gameplay and a meaningless story and a very bad ending, while I remember BioShock Infinite as a torturous linear gauntlet that didn't even allow me to take a break from playing, and didn't give me much of an opportunity to focus on the elaborate story. Maybe I'll enjoy the BioShock games more when I play them on the PS4 BioShock Collection, which hopefully fixes some of my grievances, especially with Infinite. Number 4. Final Fantasy VII. I've already talked about FF7 on YouTube, and I won't spend too much time retreading that ground, but I don't think that I was wrong in disliking it. I think my reasons are solid enough that if I replayed it, I still wouldn't be able to have fun. Final Fantasy VII is allegedly one of the greatest RPGs ever made, and while admittedly innovative for a very short span of time in the late 90s, 7 completely failed to wow me in comparison to games released around the same time, say Metal Gear Solid, Ocarina of Time, even Final Fantasy VI. It's a game so rich in cutscenes and yet so horrendous to look at. It's a game with such a complex and awe-inspiring story, and yet the awful English translation butchered any immersion I could have felt. And it's a game with such a complex combat system, and yet one where each of your actions is placed on a timer that restricts your ability to plan out your strategy. In every instance where FF7 could have impressed me, I found it lacking. If only Squaresoft had taken the English localization more seriously and let me experience the cinematic masterpiece as it was meant to be, maybe it could be bumped from a 5 out of 10 to a 6 or a 7 out of 10. But even then, I still wouldn't be a fan of the Roblox-esque graphics or the restrictive battle system. Its soundtrack is its most redeeming quality, and I still enjoy the music to this day, but what I expected out of Final Fantasy VII was an emotionally moving story-driven fantasy adventure, and what I actually saw in it was an awkward, ugly travesty of localization and storytelling. Number 5. I was hyped when I bought Banjo-Kazooie. One of the most famous and beloved 3D platformers ever. I could never have expected it to disappoint. But actually playing Banjo-Kazooie was unbearably tedious. Nintendo 64 games can be very hard to revisit. Really, PlayStation 1 sets the standard for camera controls with its analog DualShock controller, and playing a platformer with the 64's C buttons is a nightmare. Banjo-Kazooie was much lengthier than I could have guessed, with long and overbearing levels where I would often spend 30 to 60 minutes just walking around before eventually losing HP or falling off a cliff and then being forced to start all over. Of course, the soundtrack is great, but the levels are much too long for a gameplay formula that really boils down to nothing more than walking around and picking stuff up. The collectathon genre is obviously not for me, especially not if you're going to make levels this large and gameplay this slow where you can still be forced to start over at any moment. In addition to the soundtrack, the graphics are also extremely advanced for their time, possibly the best graphics on the 64, with a world full of movement and anthropomorphized objects. But outside the levels, you spend a surprising amount of time backtracking through Gruntilda's tower, through which you are forced to collect an astronomical amount of collectibles to continue onward, a much higher ratio of collectibles than you're required to find in Super Mario 64. Banjo-Kazooie has good graphics and music, but it drags on way longer than I would have liked. It's exceedingly difficult, yet slow and boring. It culminates in one of the worst final bosses I have ever had to suffer through. And possibly the worst part of its design is that every time you save and quit, you get a game over screen that shames you by telling you that you've lost, Gruntilda has won, and next time you start up the game, you've lost all your extra lives and been sent to the bottom of the tower. Banjo-Kazooie was what inspired me to make this video. I spent money on it expecting to have a really good time, but now I don't know what people see in it. How could kids ever play this game? A charming cartoon world, sure, with catchy music, but mediocre and difficult platforming, levels that are too strict and take too long, a tedious formula with very little variety, a horrible final boss, and the nerve to mock and punish the player every time they save and quit. Aside from fixing the game over screen, the main thing I would have liked to see different in Banjo-Kazooie would be much shorter levels, let's say about half as many collectibles, and perhaps a boss in each, just to give me something new to do to break up the monotony of walking around. I would have also preferred if you didn't need to collect so many items to reach the top of the tower, and if the final boss were actually good. And that's the end of the video. Let me know if I made you angry by hating one of your favorite childhood things. Goodbye.